So in the final few slides, I want to point out a few examples of those who began to scrape blacks out of this period of the nadir of black existence, and those who fought for black rights and equality even in the midst of this incredibly segregationist and racist period, often at great peril to themselves. The first is a woman named Ida B. Wells, who you see pictured here. Ida B. Wells was a school teacher in Memphis, had little thought of becoming an activist herself until at one point in her career she was walking down the streets of Memphis and saw in a store window the mutilated body of a lynching victim. This was the sort of thing that was done at that time. And she was shocked and mortified and appalled at this, and set about to research and ultimately published a history of lynching called Southern Horrors, which was published in 1892. We can actually fit this book squarely in the tradition of muckraking. It fits right in with books like The Jungle and Maggie, a Girl of the Streets, and How the Other Half Lives that I described earlier, and many other books of that era. But the idea is the same. This is a reality that perhaps many people were not aware of, and Ida B. Wells opens our eyes to, in fact, the horrors of lynching and the realities of lynching. Ida B. Wells was also one of the founding members of the NAACP and undertook great activism to try to prevent lynchings and publicize lynchings. You might be aware that the NAACP would hang a black flag out of its office windows in New York City anytime there was a lynching, and that black flag was hanging almost every day. And so this became Ida B. Wells' real driving movement, the anti-lynching campaign. There are some fascinating stories that evolve out of this campaign. It was frequently women, middle-class reformers like a Jane Addams, but in this case their cause was anti-lynching. As I described to you, lynchings were publicized and advertised in many cases, and so people would know a few days in advance that this was going to occur. And so the anti-lynch movement often would show up and throw themselves in front of the mob and try to prevent the lynching that was going to take place. There are, as you can imagine, many different results that come out of these kind of actions, heroic, bold actions. Sometimes they were attacked themselves. Most times they were sort of driven off and the lynching took place. And in a handful of cases they did manage to save the life of the potential victim of these lynchings. What the NAACP really wanted was a federal anti-lynching law, which did come up a number of times for discussion in the United States Congress, but never passed. And in fact, even to this day, we don't have a federal anti-lynching law, which on the one hand might seem shocking, and you might even now wonder why would this not be considered a federal crime. On the other hand, murder already is a crime, and in theory those who perpetrate a lynching could be pursued under other kinds of laws, but the reality was simply political at that time. This was a political hot potato. It was too controversial for most congressmen to consider, and never does become a federal law. The second black activist that I want to mention is Booker T. Washington, perhaps the most famous black activist of his era. Washington was himself raised in slavery and, of course, achieves freedom as all slaves do in the aftermath of slavery. But he was among the most famous people of his era to contemplate How is the black race going to overcome the many challenges and many hurdles that are placed before them in this era? And his most famous work was his autobiography called Up from Slavery. And he wrestles with exactly those kinds of questions in this book. He also very famously shared his views on this issue in a speech at the Atlanta Exposition of 1895. This was a speech given to a primarily white audience and essentially appealing to whites to utilize blacks who were there in their communities, hire black workers, and so on. Booker T. Washington was very popular with whites in this era. In fact, he was the first black man to meet with a president, met with Theodore Roosevelt. But perhaps one of the reasons that he was popular with a white audience is that his views were known as being accommodationist. We might also describe them as realistic. Booker T. Washington understood the limitations that his race confronted. Even decades after the end of slavery, they are still largely unskilled, largely uneducated. How are they going to move forward in society? And so Washington, in essence, called for blacks to accept white dominance, white rule in the short term, learn a trade, learn skills, primarily agriculture and manual labor in these early years, and then gradually they will work their way up as the generations go by. Perhaps the next generation, we might see more blacks going to college, and the generation after that would make even greater gains. So he called for a very long and slow process of moving forward, which, as we'll see in a moment, was not popular with many blacks. But whites were willing to listen to this because it allowed them to maintain their position of dominance. Washington, among many other things, established the Tuskegee Institute, a black college that concentrated on technical and vocational training. This was established in 1881 in Alabama. And again, it concentrates in large measure on agriculture, but on other skills and manual labor, which will allow blacks to take jobs and, as I mentioned, begin gradually moving forward through society. The last of the black activists that I want to mention at this time is W.E.B. Du Bois. You may be familiar to some extent with the history of this era. He is often seen as a rival of Booker T. Washington. He is half a generation or so younger than Booker T. Washington, and perhaps that makes a difference. He is from a different generation that may not be as willing to accept white dominance. They're certainly not as accommodationist as Booker T. Washington was. But Du Bois is also very different in terms of his background. He was Harvard educated, one of the first African Americans to achieve a PhD from Harvard University. And so he takes a different view on things. Du Bois was an accomplished scholar and historian. I mentioned to you his attempts to counter the film Birth of a Nation with his own film called Birth of a Race, which happens in 1915 and a little bit after. There are many books to his credit, many articles as well, but the most famous is called The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1903. And contrary to Washington's view that blacks should concentrate on vocational training and manual labor in the short term, Du Bois argues that blacks can begin moving forward immediately, moving forward now, taking professional jobs, getting college degrees, and forging their way rapidly upward through society. They will do this, he argues, with the guidance and support of what he calls the talented tenth, a highly educated black elite, as it happens, like himself, who show blacks that in fact we don't need to wait another generation or 2 or 3 generations to begin moving forward. We can begin moving forward now. There are those of us who have gone to college, who have gotten higher degrees, who are lawyers and doctors and philosophers and authors and historians and all these other things. Follow our lead, in essence, is what Du Bois says. Du Bois also was the founding member of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in 1909. The NAACP did a number of important things. I mentioned the anti-lynching campaign a moment ago, but its primary objective was to attack racial discrimination through the courts, to support and pursue test cases challenging the Jim Crow laws and the racist laws on the books all around the country in that period. Du Bois is a terrifically important figure and rightfully is perhaps the most well-known of the black activists of this day. But it must be said that on some level his message was lost to many of the blacks of his era who could not conceive of something like a college education or becoming a doctor or becoming a lawyer. These were pipe dreams for the great majority of blacks. Imagine sharecroppers in this era hearing about the words of Du Bois. And so what we will see as we go forward, and in a future chapter we will come back to this idea of black activism and blacks making progress. We have Washington, who is too accommodationist, too willing to accept white rule. We have Du Bois, whose teachings in some ways make sense, but they are also lofty and perhaps unrealistic. And so we're going to need to have other black activists who speak more to blacks at a grassroots level and at a realistic level. And we will see there are black activists coming soon in the 19-teens who will perhaps more than either of these black activists connect with the masses of blacks in the country.